The 11:48 p.m. notification lit up my phone like a distress flare in a dark room. Transfer complete. $75,000 sent to Morgan Bali Fund. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I just stared at the glowing numbers on the screen, the rain outside my Seattle apartment window blurring the city lights into streaks of gray and gold. That money wasn't just digits in a bank account. It was 3 years of freelancing, of sleeping on a futon, of eating instant noodles while I designed sustainable homes for people who could afford them. It was my master's degree tuition. It was the seed capital for my own firm. And now, with a single tap authorized by my father, it was gone. Liquidated to pay for a destination vow renewal for my sister Morgan, who apparently needed a win after her first marriage imploded. I closed my laptop with a snap that echoed in the silent room. Cold. Final. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to know who I'm talking to. Drop a comment with your city and the current time. I want to see how far this story travels. I drove to Mercer Island the next morning. The rain hadn't stopped, just thinned into a relentless drizzle that coated everything in a sheen of cold. My parents' house was a glass box perched on a cliff, beautiful and transparent, exactly the kind of place where secrets were impossible to hide but easy to ignore. I found them in the living room, surrounded by open suitcases and designer clothes. My mother, Tiffany, held up a silk caftan, frowning at the light. Thomas, my father, was on his tablet checking flight upgrades. They looked up when I walked in, not with guilt but with mild annoyance, like I was a delivery driver arriving too early. "Sophia," my mother said, smoothing the fabric. "You're here. We're a bit chaotic right now. Morgan is having a crisis about the floral arrangements." I didn't sit down. I stood in the doorway, my hands deep in my coat pockets, feeling the weight of the house key I still carried. "Why?" I asked. Just one word. My father didn't even look up from his screen. "It's temporary, Sophia. Don't be dramatic. Morgan needs this. She's had a rough year, and you're capable. You always figure it out. You can earn it back in 6 months." Earn it back. Like my life was just a faucet they could turn on and off at will. Like my stability was a resource they were entitled to harvest. I looked around the room at the Italian leather sofas, the original art on the walls, the sheer unadulterated excess. They weren't borrowing money. They were extracting value. I realized then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that I wasn't their daughter. I was their insurance policy. Their backup generator, the utility that kept the lights on in their golden child's life. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key, and placed it gently on the marble console table. It made a dull clink. Then I took out my phone, opened the banking app, and deleted my father's access. I watched the little trash can icon spin and vanish. Done. "I'm not an asset class," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor I felt inside. "And this bank is closed." My mother finally looked at me, really looked at me, her eyes widening slightly. "Sophia, don't be petty. We're family." I turned and walked out the door, the rain hitting my face like a baptism. I didn't slam it. I just closed it. As I drove away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror, I didn't feel free. Not yet. I felt the invisible chain of the survivor snapping. For years, I'd been making micro-investments in them, fixing their Wi-Fi, mediating their arguments, lending them cash I never saw again. I thought I was buying love. I thought I was paying dues. But now I realized those weren't investments. They were sunk costs. And the only way to win was to stop the bleed. To cut the loss and walk away before they bankrupt me completely. The site office in Portland was a shipping container. That's not a metaphor. It was a literal steel box, painted a dull industrial gray, sitting on a muddy lot where a new eco-complex was supposed to rise. Inside, it smelled of wet concrete and stale coffee. I sat at a folding table, my breath fogging in the unheated air, sketching, drafting plans by the light of a camping lantern because the generator was fickle. This was my life now. While Morgan posted photos of $500 floating breakfasts in Bali, hashtags blessed and second chances, I was eating cold peanut noodles and trying to keep my ink from smudging in the damp. It was unglamorous. It was gritty. It was cold. But it was mine. I worked as a freelance drafter for a firm that demanded perfection and paid in exposure and late checks. I took every shift, every overflow project, every tedious detail drawing that the senior architects didn't want to touch. I became a machine of production. I blocked my family on everything: phone, email, social media. Silence was the only luxury I could afford. But I kept one window open, a burner account completely anonymous, just to monitor Dylan, Morgan's husband. The tech entrepreneur who always seemed to be on the verge of a breakthrough that never came. His posts were getting desperate. Manic stories about crypto yields blurry charts that promised the moon, hashtags about grinding and hustling that felt less like inspiration and more like panic. He was the weak link. I knew it. I just needed to wait for the snap. 6 months in, I secured my first solo contract. It wasn't a skyscraper. It was a green micro-housing project for a local nonprofit. Tiny, efficient, sustainable units for transitional living. The budget was tight, the timeline was impossible, and the fee was barely enough to cover my rent. But when I stamped the blueprints with my own seal, Sophia Vance Architect, I felt a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the camping lantern. It was the first thing I had built that they couldn't touch, that they couldn't liquidate, that they couldn't trade for a party. I framed the first permit approval and hung it on the corrugated metal wall of my container. It was crooked. It was cheap. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The micro-housing project won a regional sustainability award. It was a small plaque, really made of recycled glass, but it caught the light in a way that made people stop and look. A major tech developer saw it. He saw the efficiency, the elegance, the way I used constraints not as limits but as design features. He called me the next day. "I want you to design our new eco-campus," he said. $3.5 million. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white and said, "When do we break ground?" I incorporated my own firm that afternoon. Aura Architects. A name that suggested light atmosphere, something intangible but undeniable. I moved out of the shipping container and into a real office, a loft space with exposed brick and actual heating. I hired a junior drafter. I bought a proper desk chair. I started pouring the concrete foundation of my own life, one billable hour at a time. Meanwhile, the cracks in the family facade were starting to show. Dylan's tech startup wasn't just stalling, it was nosediving. His posts shifted from Lamborghinis to vague motivational quotes about resilience and haters. And then the text came. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon via a neighbor's phone because I'd blocked everyone else. "Sophia, we need to talk. It's urgent. Please." My mother. I stared at the message, the familiar hook trying to catch in my gill. They didn't know about the award. They didn't know about the contract. They didn't know I was the CEO of my own firm. They only knew their own funds were drying up, and they needed their utility back online. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it. I just analyzed it. I dissected it like a structural failure. Why now? Why this tone? I realized then that they didn't love Morgan more than me. They didn't even like her more. They loved the image Morgan provided. She was the trophy, the shiny object that validated their vanity. I was the utility, the plumbing, the wiring, necessary but invisible, until it stopped working. They weren't reaching out because they missed their daughter. They were reaching out because the toilet was backing up and they didn't know how to fix it. This psychological autopsy killed the last shred of guilt I had. I wasn't abandoning them. I was simply refusing to be a plumber for a house that was already burning down. I put the phone away and went back to my drafting table. The golden ratio awaited. I hired a forensic accountant. Not because I was paranoid, but because I was thorough. If I was going to build an empire, I needed to make sure the ground beneath it wasn't poisoned. I needed to ensure my new assets were bulletproof, untouchable by any familial claim or debt. The accountant, a sharp woman named Elena, with glasses that magnified her skepticism, came back to me a week later. She looked pale. "You need to see this," she said, sliding a file across the desk. It wasn't just the $75,000. That was the tip of the iceberg. The real horror was buried deeper. Dylan, the genius tech husband, the man my parents adored because he reflected their own shallow ambitions, had convinced Thomas and Tiffany to sign a power of attorney 6 months ago. For tax optimization, he'd said, to protect their estate, to grow their wealth. He hadn't invested their money. He had leveraged it. He had taken out a high-risk margin loan against their Mercer Island home, the glass box on the cliff, the symbol of their status. He bet the house on a crypto coin that had crashed 90% in the last month. The house wasn't just underwater, it was drowning. It was anchored to the bottom of the ocean. And because they had signed that document, because they had been so eager to believe in the fairy tale of easy wealth, they were liable. They weren't just broke. They were facing fraud investigations if they couldn't cover the margin call. They were accomplices to their own destruction. I closed the file. The room was silent, save for the hum of the server rack in the corner. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Not pity, not fear, but the grim satisfaction of a structural engineer watching a bridge collapse exactly where she predicted it would. They had traded my future for a party, and now the bill had arrived. And it was staggering. The groundbreaking ceremony for the eco-campus was a high-end affair. It wasn't just a construction site. It was a statement of intent. Investors in tailored suits mingled with city officials, press photographers adjusted their lenses, and a string quartet played something modern and sharp near the catering tent. I stood on the podium, the wind whipping my hair, feeling the vibrations of the heavy machinery waiting to dig. I was wearing a hard hat and a structured blazer, looking out at the crowd, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a project. It was validation. It was $3.5 million of trust placed in my hands. And then I saw them. My parents. They looked disheveled. My father's suit, usually impeccable, was wrinkled and hung loosely on his frame, his tie undone at the collar. My mother's hair was wind-blown, her face devoid of the makeup she used to wear like armor. They looked like ghosts who had wandered into the wrong party, blinking in the harsh light of my reality. They weren't on the guest list. They shouldn't have been past security. But desperation has a way of slipping through cracks. They cornered me near the catering tent as I stepped down to greet a council member. Their eyes darted around, nervously scanning the crowd as if they expected to be thrown out at any second. "Sophia," my mother hissed, grabbing my arm with a grip that was painful in its intensity. "We need to talk. Now. It's an emergency." I looked at her hand on my sleeve, then up at her face. There was no recognition in her eyes. She didn't see the CEO of Aura Architects. She didn't see the woman who had just secured the city's biggest green contract. She saw the same thing she had always seen: a resource, a utility, a backup plan. "We need you to co-sign a bridge loan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just for a few months. To save the house. The bank is moving forward with the auction. We just need your signature. We know you're freelancing, we know it's tight, but if you have any credit..." I stared at them. They still thought I was struggling. They thought I was here as a guest or maybe a junior staffer fetching coffee. They didn't see the name on the banner behind me. Aura Architects. They didn't see the way the investors nodded at me. They were so consumed by their own drowning that they couldn't see the ship I was captaining. I pulled my arm away, brushing off her touch like it was ash. I didn't say a word. I stepped back onto the podium. I signaled the AV team. The lights dimmed. A massive three-dimensional holographic model of the Eco Tower shimmered into existence above us, rotating slowly, gleaming with light and promise. It was breathtaking. A vertical forest of glass and greenery, a testament to resilience and efficient design. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, my voice amplified, booming across the site and echoing off the nearby buildings. "This is the future. Fully funded. $3.5 million secured. And it starts today." The crowd erupted in applause. Flashbulbs popped. I looked down from the podium. My parents froze. Their mouths hung open. They stared at the hologram, then at the banner, then at me. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The daughter they had dismissed, the asset they had liquidated to fund a party, was the architect of this empire. I walked down the steps straight to them. The crowd parted for me. I pulled out my tablet, swiped to the foreclosure notice I had found in the public records the night before, and held it up to my father's face. The screen glowed with the details of their ruin. "I didn't build a bridge loan," I said, my voice, low lethal, meant only for their ears. "I built an empire. You're trespassing." My father reached out, his hand shaking, maybe to touch me, maybe to take the tablet. I stepped back. I signaled the security detail I had hired specifically for this possibility. "Remove them," I said. As they were escorted away, stumbling and looking back at me with a mixture of horror and awe, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I felt the same way I felt when I signed off on a demolition order for a condemned building. It was necessary work. You have to clear the rot before you can pour the foundation. I turned back to my investors, smiled, and picked up the golden shovel. It was time to break ground. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely structural. The foreclosure went through within the month. The glass house on Mercer Island, the stage for so much of their performance, was seized by the bank. I didn't attend the auction. I saw the notice online, a digital tombstone for their lifestyle. My parents moved into a rental condo in Bellevue. A beige box with thin walls and no view, the kind of place they used to sneer at when they drove past. Morgan, the golden child, who had never been asked to lift anything heavier than a champagne flute, was forced to get a job as a receptionist at a dental office to help pay the legal fees for Dylan. Dylan's tech empire dissolved the moment the forensic accountants started peeling back the layers. He was under investigation for securities fraud and wire fraud. The fairy tale had dissolved into litigation and bad debt. 6 months later, I stood on the unfinished top floor of the Eco Tower. The wind howled through the steel girders, a wild, living sound. The city of Seattle lay spread out below me, gray and wet and alive. Rain washed over the concrete, cleaning it, curing it. I wore my hard hat, not as a costume, but as a crown. I thought about the cost of my freedom. It had been high. It had been painful. There were nights I woke up missing the idea of a family, even if the reality had been toxic. But looking at the structure rising around me, knowing every beam, every bolt, every line was mine, I knew it was worth it. I realized then that I didn't burn them down. I didn't have to. I just stopped holding up the roof they were destroying from the inside. Gravity did the rest. They had spent their lives consuming money, consuming status, consuming me. I had spent my life building. And in the end, consumption always collapses on itself. Construction endures. Revenge isn't about destruction. I realized watching a ferry cut through the dark water of the Sound. That's a myth. Revenge is about construction. The best way to defeat those who tried to bury you isn't to dig them a grave. It's to grow so tall, so strong, so undeniable that they have to crane their necks just to see the bottom of your shoes. I was the planter of my own future. The harvest was just beginning. I walked to the edge where the safety railing met the open air. I didn't hate them. I didn't wish them harm. I just didn't carry them anymore. I had evicted them from my mind, foreclosed on their access to my life, and demolished the guilt they had installed. If you're currently building your life on the rubble of someone else's doubt, keep going. Don't let them rent space in your head. Evict them, and build your own table. Share this story if you're ready to break ground on your own future.